Hi guys, welcome back to this video. I wanted to make a follow-up and unfortunately it's not a particularly cheerful one and I really wish I didn't feel compelled to make this video, but I do. This is a follow-up to a video I made a while back about the Southport related incident and the riots that occurred as a consequence to the 3 young girls who were brutally murdered in a knife attack. Now I made this video not long after this incident occurred, and I talked about some of the reasons as to why, and you can watch the video, click on the link up here if you want to see the actual full thing I did. But in summary, I mentioned how there have been tensions within the UK generally, England in particular I feel, when it comes to issues of mass immigration that the general public perceives as being too high on average, and illegal immigration which is not being properly handled, people who are crossing the channel illegally and not actually having legitimate claims to asylum. I don't think you can claim asylum from France, for example. Not only that, but it seems as if the UK government has failed to enforce any kind of policy that ensures that the people from different cultures who come here legally adopt into the English way of life. In other words, hold to tenets that the average English person in your town or city or church or community is going to hold to. For example, we think it's permissible for women to show their face. That's a pretty basic requirement to assimilate into the UK. It's been a while since I went to Scotland or to Ireland, but I have a funny feeling they would agree with that. And likewise, a plethora of other culturally sensitive issues that are not resolved in the UK. Rather, the UK government seems to turn a blind eye and doesn't want to address these issues directly, largely because it seems they are afraid of the consequences if they do try to tackle these issues and how they might be labelled by certain groups if they do so. But what was interesting was I mentioned all these issues in my video and I talked about how this is just demonstrably a complete failure on behalf of the UK government. But I did also mention the Southport incident itself with the 3 young girls who tragically died in a knife attack by someone who words can't describe. There's a special place. Let's say that. But I thought this isn't actually really that relevant. It happened to be a catalyst. It definitely was a catalyst for those riots that occurred across the UK following this absolute tragedy of those 3 young girls who had been brutally murdered in a knife attack. But I thought, realistically, looking at the evidence, and I looked at what mainstream media was reporting, try to get a balanced view, try to avoid anything that was just obvious propaganda, anything that was just some sort of extreme right wing, he was X, Y, and Z and all this stuff. I just went with what mainstream media was reporting, so I thought, hey, that's what I can trust. And it was clear that he was the son of immigrants who were originally from Rwanda. Now, Rwanda is a majority Christian nation. And since there was no evidence of him being in any way radicalized into Islam, I didn't think there was any reason to suppose he was anything other than either a Christian or an atheist or an agnostic or basically anything. So I thought, yeah, it's not to do with extremist religion or religious beliefs. It's nothing to do with Islamic beliefs at all. And I also thought it's not an issue of illegal immigration because his parents came here, to my knowledge, completely legally. And I also didn't think it was an issue of how he was raised because he was probably raised by a fairly westernized family at this point who would have sent him to a Western school which taught him Western values. So it seemed to me as if this was a non-starter. There was no real issue here other than just the absolute tragedy that this person turned out to be a complete piece of and it was simply that. It was just the individual being evil as hell. And that's the end of it. But ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately that was not the case. So I went on the BBC website and BBC has let me know some amazing things. Turns out I was totally wrong by following mainstream news reporting that was publicly available. I was completely wrong by staying off Twitter and just sticking to what the BBC website told me because the BBC got it wrong. They published an article with the following. Teen accused of Southport murders facing terror charge. That's interesting. I thought it wasn't terror related. I thought this guy was just, had some mental problem or was just he was just like an evil mastermind, no particular ideology or belief. He just did it for the fun of it because he's a twisted individual. No, turns out it was terror. The teenager accused of murdering 3 young girls in Southport has been charged with producing the poison ricin. Okay. So he's following some sort of instructions to produce a toxin. That kind of sounds like he may have had help from someone. Wish I knew that before. And possessing a military study of an Al-Qaeda training manual. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic terrorist group. So before we even go any further, ladies and gentlemen, the idea that this was an isolated incident it's not true at all. This actually is part of the broader problem that we have in the UK, where we have a very divisive, very split, very ununified population of people with radically different beliefs that do not at all have foundational views in common. Most of the public probably don't think that martyrdom is a particularly appropriate thing to do in the name of your God, or in the name of Allah. But there are people, it seems, in this country who have a slightly more favourable view of that, or at least possibly do. And some of them, like the guy who was responsible for killing these 3 young girls, they seem to be prepared to act on it and just casually download a terrorist manual of Al-Qaeda, as you do, you know? You're bored one night, you're on the internet, just Google Al-Qaeda training manual. Why not? Make some ricin. It's all good. Definitely not a wannabe terrorist. So both the ricin and the study of the training manual were found as part of searches of the suspect's house in the Lancashire village of Banks following the stabbing. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here, since I feel that there have been people who've been very deceptive at some point in this. You don't search the person's house months or even weeks following an attack. If you apprehend someone because he just stabbed 3 young girls in broad daylight, you go to that person's house and you do a little bit of a search with that warrant that you got pretty easy because he did it in broad daylight. So I don't buy for a second that it took them this long to find this information. I don't believe that. My opinion is that they knew about this from the beginning, but because there were riots forming across the UK, the information was withheld in order to not inspire any more riots. I think that was the intent. And the irony, of course, is that the riots were a response of government's failure to address this issue, along with just general claims of two-tier policing, where it seems as if different cultures, or people who belong to different cultures, are treated differently than the average Joe Bloggs who lives down the road. What really bothers me about this, just to be honest with you, and I think why it inspired this initial reaction in me, is because you're being gaslit into thinking that even if you have this idea that maybe this is something to do with terrorism, maybe this is something to do with another faith that's not Christianity and it's not atheism, there's no militant atheists making ricin in their basements, you're somehow thought of as being prejudice and you're doing a bad thing. But in reality, you were being coerced into believing something different, a different narrative, in order to achieve political goals by the government. And I just don't think that's fair. I think that's a deeply immoral thing to do, to lie intentionally, assuming they didn't know about this, and that's my opinion. Maybe they didn't know, but I think they did. It doesn't take you that long to search someone's belongings. And it's just sad. Don't get me wrong, I want to make it clear as well, I absolutely do not agree with any kind of violent rioting at all. It isn't warranted, and when you go down that path, you end up being as bad, okay, maybe not as bad as this guy, but you end up being pretty bad. So violent rioting is a big no-no. But I also want to make it clear that that's often interpreted as if I'm just talking about one group. I'm not. I'm talking about both groups. In the UK rioting after the Southport event, where again, I remind everyone here, 3 young girls were tragically killed because of this man and his Al-Qaeda manual ricin in his home. There were people who were supportive of the English culture, is probably the best way of perhaps framing this, or the British culture, who were violent, who went out and attacked people, who damaged property. But there's another side of it, which I actually think is the far right side, and I think this is a better use of terms. The Muslim communities of predominantly young men who came out, not for English values, but for their own Islamic values, because they perceived this as an attack, and they met this with physical violence on the streets, and there's tons of footage you can watch online of this, probably also reported by the BBC. Thanks, BBC. You can clearly see that actually both sides are wrong here. And I also think it's important to understand the framing of this. Far right, in terms of political ideology, more closely follows the Islamic belief generally, and I mean that in a very broad sense, than it does to the average guy who's upset at immigration. The average guy who's upset at high levels of immigration, poor assimilation into the English culture, two-tier policing, probably thinks it's okay for your wife to go out with her face exposed. Probably thinks that it's okay if you want to be gay in your own private life. Probably thinks that it's okay to have a drink of alcohol if you want to. Probably thinks you can eat a bacon sandwich if you feel the need. Probably thinks that you don't have to kill an animal in a particularly violent way in the name of your God before you eat it. Probably doesn't think very bad things about the average Jew. Probably doesn't think very bad things about a certain country beginning with the letter I. So those, to me, those views, Those are far-right views. Those are extremist views, and they're not commonly found in the UK, or at least most parts of the UK, not commonly found. But the more you have people from different nations that don't properly assimilate and adopt the English culture, you end up with these differing communities that are not going to get along. And you're going to have increased tensions. Now, the government could address this, and the first step to addressing any issue is to acknowledge that there is indeed an issue. Somehow I don't see that happening with this government, or the next, to be brutally honest with you. But you can hope. So keep this in mind when you see and hear people labeling just one side as the far right. If you really want to look at it objectively, it's actually people who are pretty left, like considering things, and then a very obvious far right. And this is, of course, the general Muslim perspective. This isn't even a radical Muslim perspective. This is just basic tenets of a religion called Islam. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I am wanting to make a video on this because it just upset me that, man, I believed it. Completely believed that, hook, line, and sinker, that he had nothing to do with Islam. But it now looks like the evidence is showing that he did. Anyway, God bless you all. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.